BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today I'm really thrilled to welcome Misha Glenny to this podcast, a distinguished historian, distinguished author and journalist, and also the rector of the IWM in Vienna, the Institute for Human Sciences, where I myself briefly had the privilege of being a fellow, and where there are some of the most exciting people in the intellectual world coming in and out, giving lectures, working together. It's a very exciting place. Misha, a pleasure to welcome you onto the BlomCast.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. It's a pleasure to be here.
Misha, turning points in history. You are sort of an expert in turning points. You have been interested in that, much like I myself have been. You've written about the Balkans and the history of the Balkans. You've written about McMafia and globalized organized crime. But we live in the same city. We drink the old glass of wine together, that I think we can admit. And we chat about the world a few times. And well, the biggest turning point in history that you could think about is probably right now. Now, there are so many things to unpick here. The end of the West, which I have spoken about with some guests on this podcast, what that may mean, what the amplitude of this thing may be, whether it's just the end of a transatlantic partnership or whether it's the end of a much bigger project, a project of 300 years, a project of encasing individual rights and liberal values and democracy, which may sort of turn out to be just an episode in history if we're not very careful. You do a lot of research, you do a lot of speaking to people. This is such a disorienting time. How can you find some points of reference to analyze and understand all the catastrophic, bizarre, absurd news that is washing over us day by day and seemingly washes away structures that we thought were eternal?
Well, this is a very good, but a question whose answer is without end in a way. So if you find me rabbiting on for too long, do bring me to a halt. But I'd say two things that struck me over the past year or so. One which struck me this week. I was talking to my wife, who's in London at the moment, and I said to her, Kirst, I'm just finding this pattern of waking up in the morning, scrolling through the New York Times, scrolling through the Financial Times, scrolling through the Guardian, scrolling through ORF News and all the other newspapers that I read, before I even make myself a cup of tea, in order just to try and keep up roughly with what's happening. I said, I'm beginning to find this so debilitating that I need to sort of manage it, because, and this is the difference between what we're experiencing now and other turning points in history. The really fundamental difference, which I'll come back to, is the issue of scale, of magnitude, of speed, of breadth of implications of the individual events which are taking place. But I'll come back to that, and I'll come back to this period, just to say that it is, for so many of us, utterly exhausting. And what's interesting is that it happens very soon in historical terms after what was another major turning point in history, and that was 1989, where, of course, the certainties of the post-Second World War all came to an end, again in a very short space of time. That's the nature of revolutions, although it took a longer time between, say, the collapse of communism and the consolidation of a tentative new world order. It took a longer time before that became clear. So let me put it like this. I see there's 1789 to 1989, exactly 200 years, divided between 89 and 1914, 1789 and 1914, the beginning of the First World War, from the French Revolution at the beginning of the First World War, and then 1914 to 1945, and then 1945 to 1989. But then we have this curious interregnum, the long 1990s, which, as you identified, was filled with optimism, or you indicated that the 90s appeared to be a period of considerable hope, and this is the fabled end of history, as articulated by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama. And that came to an end in 2001 with the Twin Towers, where that 10 years in which the United States were, well, there was an acronym at the time, the SRSP, the sole remaining superpower. The United States in the 1990s actually failed to act responsibly as the sole remaining superpower. And we can, if we were to examine the 1990s very carefully, we would see the roots of a lot of the problems which we're facing now.
Tell me, were the so-called West and the Soviet Union really Siamese twins and we just didn't realize it? And the death of the one meant that the other one couldn't long survive?
No, I don't think so, because I see them rather as societies in parallel. The difference between today and the Cold War period is there was relatively little interaction between the communist world and the capitalist world. And where that interaction took place, it tended to be in the global south, or what we then called the third world or the developing world, where a series of proxy wars, which were extremely unpleasant for the people who found themselves caught in the crossfire, whether it was Vietnam or Ethiopia, or if you were extremely misfortunate and happened to live in Central America in a place like Honduras or Guatemala, then this was very, very violent. But none of these proxy wars really, even Vietnam and even Korea, really threatened to knock the Cold War system out of kilter. They were manageable as far as the world order was concerned. The situation we have now is very different because the world is much more closely integrated. And the two greatest rivals, the United States and China, they rather remind me of those dancers during the Depression in the 1930s. There was a film made about it called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And people would do these marathon dances in order to win and get a substantial dollar prize. And by the end, after 36 hours or whatever, the couples were just holding each other up. And if one of them fell, they both fell. And it seems to me that China and the US are rather in that position. One of them falls, they both fall, and they bring everything else down with them. And that's where we are now, when Donald Trump has decided that he's no longer going to hold up China, and China's response is, well, we're not going to hold up the USA either. And the impact as they crash to the floor is something that the whole world is likely to feel. Now, they're still just about staggering on at the moment, that relationship between the US and China, but the tariffs that Trump has imposed have such grave consequences for the global economy. And during the Cold War, there is nothing that Trump or any other American president could have done to bring the global economy come crashing down in the way that it threatens to now. So that's a big difference between the Cold War and where we are now. But I'm going to be even more perverse. We can return to this area, but I'm going to be more perverse and go back to the 16th century, the 15th and the 16th century. And everyone talks now about the impact of printing and how it changed the world, all absolutely true. But there were two or three other technological developments at the time which weren't so they're not so well identified, as it were. One of them was to do with maritime technology, naval technology, and the ability of boats, in combination with developments in navigational skills, the ability of boats to leave coastal areas in safety and make it across the open ocean, which before had been done before, but it hadn't been done by rapacious European states.
That was the development of the sextant and the compass, and then the exact clock.
And exactly these new navigational abilities combined with new designs of ships as well, which enabled them to travel with greater bulk for over longer periods, so that they could carry water and so on and so forth without having going to land all the time. And this was equally important as the printing of the book. What the printing of the book did was to combine with the heresy of Martin Luther. Martin Luther, who famously in 1517 nailed his 97 Theses on the door of the Schlosskirche in Wittenberg. Martin Luther was writing in German. His work could be printed in German. His work could be translated and distributed. If you look 100 years before from Martin Luther, you had Jan Hus, the Czech religious reformer, whose theological positions were really very close to Luther, as Luther himself admitted. But Jan Hus was preaching and distributing his work in Czech, a language which very few people spoke, nor did they have much interest in learning. And he also didn't have the printing press. And so Hus's heresy remained geographically extremely constrained, and although it mobilized the Czech-speaking population of Bohemia and Moravia, and not the German-speaking population of the same area, it couldn't go beyond. Luther's message was able to go beyond because of the printing of the book, but the really crucial thing, which is often not noticed, is that Luther persuaded 3 states, Denmark, Sweden, not him personally, but his dogma, his new religious ideas, persuaded 3 states, Denmark, Sweden, and England, to adopt a form of his heresy. Now, this was the first time that heresy had been linked with political state power. And that was the game changer. That meant that the religious wars, which we saw run throughout the 16th century, culminating in 1618, in the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618, saw the coming together of political and religious dissent. At the same time, a an important area of that political religious dissent, notably the Dutch Republic, the bit of the Netherlands which was not controlled by Spain but was largely independent and run by very effective quasi-democratic town councils. They also were investing in maritime technology, and their particular design of boats turned out to be much more effective at firing heavy cannon than was the case of the galleons in Spain and Portugal. And so what you got was a challenge on a political level, on a religious level, and on a military level, which over the space of 100 years shifted the locus of power in Europe from the Mediterranean to the North Sea. And this is really when you see the emergence of an aggressive modern Northern Europe, which dominates the world for the next two or three centuries. But the oversimplification of that change is that, first of all, it was just about printing. It wasn't just about printing. And secondly, you have to look at the politics behind it. You have to look at state calculations and how they can use ideology to further their own ends. And within that process, you also see the consolidation of realpolitik for the first time, particularly, well, not for the first time, but you see the consolidation of realpolitik where religion begins to be subordinate to state interests. Religion, up until the 15th century, really dominates the calculations of states. In the 17th century, you see France determined to block Habsburg Catholic power, and France allying itself at times, not always, but at times, with Sweden, a Protestant power, in the 30 Years' War. So the idea that your religion will somehow determine your state interests is basically redundant during the 30 Years' War, and it is the ultimate reason why 1648, which are the peace treaties, the Treaty of Westphalia, a series of peace treaties, which define modern politics, i.e., religion is not enough of a reason to go to war with another state. They have to, for some reason, have provoked you for political or economic reasons, and religion is no longer that important. So that is a massive change in Europe. It leads to the accrual of power in Northern Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, and then later in England, and in the early 18th century Britain, as Scotland and England joined together as one state, combined with their maritime technology, which ushers in the era of global colonialism as opposed to the mere trashing and rape of South America that the Portuguese and the Spaniards had been involved in. So now, for the first time, we have Europeans scouring every bit of the globe for resources, and this is the beginning of the new era and an end of that long transition period, which begins in 1492 politically and ends in 1648.
Misha, I enjoy your perversion, and I enjoy springing back into the 15th century with you. We were talking about the end of the West, and you've taken us to the beginning. What is the connection?
The connection is that there are these moments of monumental change. You have written extremely well about this period, looking over it, about the determination of the West to subjugate everything in the world, not just other peoples through colonialism, not just the extraction of resources, but where it was convenient and of profit, the destruction of nature as well. And what we then see is, because the ancien regimes, these despotic, absolutist monarchies that prevailed in the 17th and 18th century, largely, although not entirely, there were counter models. We've already mentioned the United Republic of the Netherlands. But then there is a moment which is after the French Revolution, where obviously this is a challenge to absolutism everywhere, but Napoleon does something which changes the game completely. And that is, he decides to mobilize men from across the French population for the army, i.e., the army is no longer a bunch of ragtags and mercenaries and chancers. The army becomes a national project, the levée en masse. And this ushers in the politics of the nation state, which completely transforms the map in Europe and facilitates the preparation for the disastrous 20th century. Not unlike the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century, it coincides, although coincidence is the wrong word here, it happens at the same time, and there's a reason for it, with a major technological breakthrough, and that is James Watt and steam power.
It is so interesting that you're saying that, because I've been thinking recently about a connection, which I'm not sure whether it really works, but I would like to run it past you and see what you make of this. There are two things here, I think. First of all, there's a big historical theme which has now become established among historians, but which is still perhaps not strong enough in the public discourse, and that's the story of acceleration. You have described what key technologies did at one particular historical moment, but these key technologies reached relatively few people. They were relatively hard to produce. Everything was handmade and machines were still made of wood. So things took their time. The dissemination took its time. Printing, you could crank out books all of a sudden, although, of course, what we often forget, many more pamphlets were written than books, and they were much more important also in the religious wars. But while these pamphlets were very often heavily illustrated, because most people were illiterate, so only about 2% of the population were even able to read this. So this technology is terribly important. It does change the world, but it's just changed the world over generations or centuries.
But remember, just on that point of the pamphlets and the religious wars, because there's a very important point here, and that is the subjective understanding of Luther of what was going on. Luther understood what was going on. His best friend was Louis Cranach the Elder. They lived 100 meters apart from each other in Wittenberg. And Louis Cranach was a painter, first and foremost, but what a lot of people don't know is that he ran his own printing press, and he was a bookseller and distributor. And it was he who printed so many of the Lutheran pamphlets. It was he who distributed the image of Luther, so that Luther was possibly the most recognized person, certainly in the German-speaking world, arguably also all over Europe. His face was absolutely everywhere.
And of course, we have to realize what that meant at the time, because who else's face was everywhere? There was Christ,
Yep.
There was the emperor.
That's right.
There were perhaps a few writers from antiquity, Cicero also, or Plato.
That's more or less the lot in terms of, lots of people were painted and then printed, but not the extent and the degree to which Luther was distributed all over the world. So your point about acceleration, this is absolutely critical. From the invention of printing in the 1440s, it was 1648. So it was 2 centuries later that the wars of religion finally came to an end. So that's 200 years. Life had begun to change for most people to an extent at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. Things were becoming more prosperous, notwithstanding the wars. All the stuff coming from South America was beginning to filter through into Europe. But then just imagine what happens from the steam engine through to the end of the Second World War. Now, the technological differences between the way people lived their life between the 1440s and the 1640s were significant, but they weren't that big.
For a country population, for a rural population, they were hardly visible. I would say you could even extend that into the 1840s. There would have been very little change.
Very little change. So what you get in Britain at the beginning of the 19th century is the Industrial Revolution kicking in and the rural population finally starting to move into urban areas, mass producing goods, living in terrible conditions, often much worse than they lived in the countryside itself. But nonetheless, this was a big change. And then think what happens in 1837. You have the first successful communication over the telegraph in 1837. Now, until this point, communication over millennia is as fast as the fastest horses you could find. All of a sudden, within minutes, you can communicate a message from Edinburgh to London. It still takes another 20 years before the first cable is laid between Ireland, the east coast of Ireland, and Newfoundland in Canada, and you get the first transatlantic cable. And even that had a lot of teething problems. So think of that you don't get mass immediate communication until the 1860s. And 80 years later, the atom bomb is dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, this is an acceleration of technology in a way that human beings find it difficult to comprehend. If we then come to our period and look at the technological developments that we've experienced, not just since the 1990s, but since the invention of the iPhone in 2007, our lives have been impacted at a speed.
Since ChatGPT 2 years ago.
Since ChatGPT, every year, massive things are happening in technology, and we cannot possibly absorb their implications.
There's one question that really interests both of us, and you have taken us back a few centuries, and one question that I'm sort of getting into, and that is a question of scale or upscaling or concentration, because let's go back to, as you said, the 15th, 16th century, and you find that if you are a ruler and you want to have more power and you want to have economic power, what you need is people. All rulers in Europe are desperate to get more people into their empires. Why? Very clear, because they're only really a few energy sources available, there is mainly muscle power of people and animals, and then there's a bit of wind and a bit of water, and, for smithies and so a bit of fire to melt iron or so. It is impossible to scale this up. You can build 10 water mills behind each other, but they still only have a single axle, and that is all made of wood, and the production will be very limited that you can have.
Particularly when your population is occasionally decimated by disease.
Yes, also that. But it also means, for instance, that accumulation of capital around this time, they accumulate in trade, but not in production, not in industry. You have Amsterdam and places like that where you've got stock exchange and people invest in ships going to the Indies and to Asia. And there is the first sort of capitalist accumulation of capital, but it is not in manufacture or in industry, simply because it's not possible to scale up production in a way that makes it more effective. That, of course, changes, as you said, with the steam engine, but importantly also with coal. And then we get a very different situation, namely that coal is hugely labor-intensive. So you need mines with tens of thousands of people, men usually, working in them. It's also hard to transport, so you need your heavy industry close to your mines. And that means all of a sudden you can scale up production and you can make huge profits, but you're locally fixed. And that gives the people who work there, once they have learned to organize themselves and represent themselves, quite a lot of bargaining power. Because if they want to strike, then production will cease.
And the other thing that runs in parallel with this, I know where you're heading with this, but the other thing that runs in parallel with this is the fact that in Europe, for example, between the beginning of the 19th century through to the 1970s, so over 150 years or so, life expectancy, having been bobbling along at between 35 to 40 years old for centuries, in the space of just over a century, life expectancy increases from 35 to 40 to 70, 72. Right? That's absolutely extraordinary in terms of your original point about you need people. Because, as you said, when we move over to the capitalist mode of production, you still need a lot of people. And actually, it's quite useful if those people remain healthy for a long period of time.
And also, of course, you can, a la Manchester capitalism, use them as slaves, but you can also become a bit more clever and in a social democratic system, use them as your own consumers or make them into your own consumers and say, actually, it's not so bad if they're not hungry and if they've got a bit of money to spend, because then they can buy the stuff we make.
Pretty much took the Second World War to work that out widespread, but yes.
Yeah, so the value of social peace. But I mean, if you already know where I'm going, I think the first great crack in this system comes with oil, which is not so labor intensive, not produced where the industry used to be, shippable anywhere, and so all of a sudden you can find much cheaper places for production. But that, of course, devastates the places where the production was before, where the mining was before. Those people also lose their political bargaining power, no longer feel represented, are no longer represented. Okay, but what happens now when the possibility of technological concentration and upscaling is completely different, and we are left with key technologies that employ very few people, need very little labor, and really also don't need much participation from anybody else? What does that kind of system still need democracy and participation?
I want to read a particular paragraph to you that I had researched. Here we are. So big tech is much less reliant on human productivity than are most traditional industries. In the information age, value resides less in labor and more in data. If you can persuade consumers to freely contribute their data to your factory, in inverted commas, then not only are your costs minimal compared to those in physical manufacturing, You don't have to negotiate workers' habitual demands for improved wages and conditions. The figures speak for themselves, and these are the figures I looked up. In 2023, Volkswagen employed 675,000 people worldwide, boasting a net income of just under 18 billion euros. In the same year, Alphabet, Google's parent company, employed 184,500 men and women, but netted 72 billion. So they are employing 5 times fewer people, and they are earning 3.5 times as much money because of the nature of production in the digital age and services in the digital age. So that's to your point, basically. People become less important as part of the productive process. They still have to be there as consumers, but a lot of the value that they have, they hand over to the people who are making money. That's the data thing, and that's why Chris Anderson's book Free, which seemed to suggest that the internet will bring in an age where so many things that were free that human beings would finally be satisfied, prosperity would be reached, and peace would be achieved, was, to put it in no uncertain terms, bullshit.
It sounds quite certain, but yes, it is. Also, for one reason that I always find interesting, in the history of our species and our previous species incarnations, evolution has made us absolute virtuosos as dealing with scarcity and want. We are fantastic at that as a species. We can deal with hunger, with deprivation, with all sorts of terrible things. But we're completely useless when it comes to abundance. Nothing has prepared us for that.
Philip, you and I are 2 great walking examples of that.
Yes, I freely admit it. I'm using myself as a guinea pig here for this very fact.
Where are we now? We're at a stage where clearly liberalism has been challenged as it rarely has been. You could argue that in the 1930s it faced a similar challenge. One of the interesting things about what we face now, the rise of populist and far-right movements in let's take Europe, let's leave the United States out of this, because in Europe we have firsthand, or at least 1 or 2 generations back, we have the knowledge and experience of knowing where that leads.
Very importantly.
And yet a large part of the population seems to be prepared to ignore the historical experience, perhaps because they haven't been taught.
But societies don't learn from history. My impression is we do as individuals the same as we do as collectives, which means that if something terrible or really incisive happens, that will stay with you for about 3 generations, as long as it's still living memory. For the 4th generation, it could be 300 years ago. And we are in that 4th generation vis-à-vis the Second World War.
What that means is that our short-term memory of history is usually pretty good. Our long-term historical memory is pretty lousy.
It's usually lamentable.
Yes, and there is a break, as you say, between the 3rd and 4th generations, and that's where we are. Having said that, the first break of the post-war consensus starts in the 1970s with Nixon, but then goes on steroids with Thatcher and Reagan, where neoliberalism is introduced. You can see this quite clearly in issues like housing, where the United Kingdom had a relatively balanced housing market until Margaret Thatcher decided to sell off all the council houses. You compare that to Vienna, where you've had a system of council houses for over 100 years, and despite the bleatings of people in Vienna, when I hear Vienna complain about the housing and the costs of housing in Vienna, I say, please just come and try and live in London for 6 months, and then you'll know what housing shortage is really about. But the housing market is just much better organized here than it is in the United Kingdom, and that was because we sold off all the social collective assets, housing assets. And, the design was, Margaret Thatcher said she wanted everyone to be a homeowner. We have never had, home owning was always a very, very big thing in the UK, unlike on the continent. We have never had a lower percentage of people owning their homes and a higher percentage of people renting. In London, it's now about 70% rental. This is a consequence of Thatcher's housing policy from the 1980s. So we do need to see, it's not just that the third generation, who the third generation after the Second World War have gone over to the fourth generation. It's also because a lot of disastrous policies, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, led to, as we know, the financial crash of 2008. And although some people like to deny a connection between 2008 and the financial crash and the rise of Trump, Brexit, and the other populist movements, I like to actually draw a connection there. I think there is a connection very clearly.
Tell me, that question of scale, of upscaling, of it sounds very Marxist, but it's about means of production. It's also about sources of energy, very importantly. There is definitely in this story an age of coal that seems to be connected with the rise of democracy. There's an age of oil that seems to be connected with globalization and neoliberalism. Now we're in energy-wise perhaps in a new age and also in a key technology. The energy may now be renewable, hooray, but this renewable energy also means it's no longer locally based so strongly. It's very likely to be in private hands. It can be solar panels. It can be even a small nuclear plant if that's possible wherever that's built. And the key technology is digital. Is that also an age of democracy? Or perhaps let me ask the question in a more interesting way. Because, this is too pointed a question to ask, because obviously the answer would be no. Obviously the answer would be we are going towards a techno-oligarchy where very few people hold the patents, own the algorithms, own the servers and whatever else you need as technical infrastructure. And there's perhaps 10% of court jesters like us who explain things and make connections and know how to work technologies and are able to do nothing about it because we're just dependent on those with power and money. And then there's a whole lot of people who are parked in front of their screens and fed highly processed foods. That's not really what we would call a democratic utopia, but can democracy coexist with such a society? Are there possibilities for democracy to thrive in such a society?
The accumulation of wealth and power of the Musks, the Gates, the Zuckerbergs of this world is incomparable. Carnegie and Frick and all of the rest of them were, by comparison, just learning to build a house out of Lego compared to these people. And, look at the value of Elon Musk. This is ridiculous. This is the GDP of, important countries around the world.
I always like to think it's not his value, just the amount of money he has.
That's right. But in value in monetary terms, let me put it like that, to be prosaic, Philip, seeing as you insist on it. But anyway, look, so I'm going to, because we've been rabbiting on for so long, I'm going to wrap up with this conclusion that that we have entered into territory which is almost entirely uncharted, and we cannot know where we're heading now, either politically. We haven't even talked about the military. I mean, one of the things that I was going to come on to when you started talking about renewable energy, first of all, is there was a famous book called by Arno Meyer, the historian, called The Persistence of the Old Regime, of the Ancien Regime. The persistence of those autocratic, absolutist monarchies. And, the persistence of oil, you have to say, oil is not giving up without a big fight, and it's got a lot of money to do it in.
It's simply too profitable.
It's too profitable. But when you look at green transitions and the need for all the critical raw materials, all the rare earth metals, the lithium, the cobalt, and so on and so forth, what's really interesting about that is you're going to need as much, and in fact that's really what this struggle about critical raw materials is about, as much for the development of new military technologies as you are for new civilian energy technologies. And this basically means that the ravaging of the earth, which the need for critical raw materials entails, is going to proceed apace as one of the biggest driving forces of all in our contemporary world is the technology war between the US and China. And Europe looks on as a slightly wizened old person with a lot of cash in its pocket, but not really knowing how to spend it in this brave new world.
Misha, I have very much enjoyed spending this hour with you. It's been free-floating and going through the centuries, but this next question of the ravaging of the earth is certainly something I'd like to talk to you again about. But for this time, thank you very much for being here.
You're welcome, good Lord Philip.
And thank you for listening to the BlomCast. Please subscribe, tell your friends, tell your dearest enemies, tell frankly everyone, shout it from the rooftops. The BlomCast is here and it's fantastic. Thank you for this time, and thank you to Misha Glenny. Goodbye.